My son told me not to come for Christmas 3 hours before dinner. I was standing in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, holding the pumpkin pie I'd spent all morning baking for my grandchildren, when Michael said, "Mom, Vanessa thinks it might be awkward this year." Awkward. That was the word he used for his 69-year-old mother. I looked at the wrapped presents under my tiny tree and realized my own son was ashamed of me. He thought I was just a lonely old widow living off Social Security. What Michael didn't know was that less than 24 hours later, the entire country would learn I was one of the richest women in America, and by then, it was already too late. If this story touches your heart, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read your comments because sometimes strangers understand our pain better than family does. And if you believe parents should never be treated like a burden, please like and subscribe. I have a feeling this Christmas story is going to stay with you until the very end. People saw me as the kind of old woman they stopped noticing after a while. The cashier at my local grocery store called me sweetie in the careful voice people use with the elderly. My neighbors waved politely, but never asked many questions. The mailman once offered to carry my groceries inside because he assumed I was too fragile to lift them myself. I let them think whatever they wanted. My little house sat on a quiet street outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't fancy. The paint on the porch railings had started peeling 2 winters ago, and my old Buick groaned every time I turned the ignition key. Inside, the wallpaper in the kitchen was older than my grandchildren, but it was home. Every inch of that house carried memories of Richard. My husband had died 11 years earlier, and even after all that time, I still caught myself turning toward his empty recliner when something funny happened on television. Grief changes shape as you age. It stops screaming and starts whispering instead. Most mornings I woke up before sunrise made coffee in the same chipped ceramic mug Richard bought me in 1984 and sat by the kitchen window watching snow collect on the maple trees outside. My life was quiet, predictable, lonely sometimes, but not unhappy. The only thing that truly hurt was how distant my son had become. Michael used to call every day after Richard died. He worried about me back then. He'd drive over with groceries, fix things around the house, sit beside me at the kitchen table long after dinner was over. Then Vanessa came into his life. At first, I tried very hard to like her. She was beautiful in the polished kind of way magazine women are beautiful. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes. Vanessa cared deeply about appearances, the right neighborhoods, the right schools, the right friends, the right wine at dinner parties. And unfortunately, I did not fit into the image she wanted for her life. The first time I realized she was embarrassed by me was 3 years ago during Emma's ballet recital. I'd worn my favorite blue coat and brought flowers for my granddaughter. I remember feeling proud watching Emma twirl across the stage in her tiny pink costume. Afterward, while parents gathered in the lobby taking pictures, I overheard Vanessa speaking quietly to one of the other mothers. "She means well," Vanessa whispered, with an uncomfortable laugh. "She's just very old-fashioned." I still remember the way she looked at my coat when she said it, like I was something outdated she wished she could replace. That night, Michael told me I was imagining things. "Vanessa likes you, Mom," he insisted while staring at his phone instead of my face. But deep down, I knew better. Women my age learn to recognize fake kindness quickly, especially from family. Still, I kept trying. Every birthday, every school recital, every Thanksgiving dinner, I showed up with homemade food, thoughtful gifts, and hope tucked quietly inside my chest like a foolish little prayer. Emma and Lucas were the reason I never gave up. Emma was 11 and sensitive in a way that reminded me painfully of Michael when he was little. She noticed everything. When I visited, she'd sit beside me on the couch and ask questions nobody else bothered asking anymore. "Grandma Katrina, what was Dad like when he was my age? Grandma, how did you and Grandpa meet Grandma? Why do you still wear Grandpa's wedding ring?" Lucas was younger, louder, always running through the house like a small tornado. But every time I baked chocolate chip cookies, he hugged me around the waist before even tasting one. Children know where love is real. Adults forget. A week before Christmas, I spent an entire afternoon knitting scarves for both of them, while old jazz records played softly in the background. I smiled to myself, imagining Emma opening the lavender scarf I made her. She loved purple lately, because she said it made her feel grown up. I wrapped Lucas's scarf with a tiny toy dinosaur tucked into the bow. Simple gifts, not expensive, but filled with care. That evening, I drove to Michael's house to drop off a tin of homemade peppermint bark. Their neighborhood looked like something from a Christmas movie, huge houses glowing with white lights, expensive SUVs parked in spotless driveways. I suddenly became very aware of my old Buick rattling beside luxury cars. Vanessa opened the door wearing cream-colored cashmere and a smile so tight it looked painful. "Oh," she said. "You didn't tell us you were stopping by." "I was just in the area," I lied gently. "I made peppermint bark for the kids." She accepted the tin without inviting me inside. From behind her, I could hear laughter and clinking wine glasses. A party. Vanessa glanced over her shoulder nervously before lowering her voice. "We have guests tonight." I nodded slowly. "I won't stay." Michael appeared in the hallway then. For one hopeful second, I thought he might tell me to come inside. Instead, he kissed my cheek distractedly and said, "Thanks, Mom. Drive safe." Okay. That was it. No invitation, no warmth, just dismissal. As I walked back to my car through the freezing December wind, I noticed two women inside the house staring at me through the window. One of them whispered something that made the other laugh. I drove home gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. When I got inside my empty kitchen, I stood there silently for several minutes, staring at the tiny Christmas tree in my living room. Richard used to warn me about this kind of thing. Not specifically about Michael. About money. Money doesn't change people overnight, he told me once, many years ago. It changes them slowly, quietly, until one day you barely recognize them anymore. Back then, I thought he sounded cynical. Now, I wasn't so sure. That same night, my phone rang just after 10 o'clock. It was Ethan Caldwell, Richard's old attorney, and the only person besides my late husband who knew exactly how much I was really worth. "Katrina," he said carefully. "The board approved the final acquisition terms today." I closed my eyes. After 11 years of secrecy, everything was about to change. "You'll officially become public on December 26th, Ethan continued. "Once the merger is announced, there's no way to keep your identity private anymore." I looked around my little kitchen. The faded curtains, the old wooden table, the quiet life I had built on purpose. How much I asked softly, even though I already knew. There was a pause. Just over 3.8 billion. Outside my window, snow continued falling gently onto the empty street. And somewhere across town, my son was hosting elegant Christmas parties while feeling ashamed of the mother who had quietly built an empire without him ever noticing. 3 days before Christmas, I started preparing like I always did. I woke up early, tied my gray hair back with a ribbon, and pulled out the old recipe cards I'd used for decades. The kitchen filled with the warm smell of cinnamon butter and apples, while snow drifted softly outside my windows. For a few peaceful hours, I let myself believe things were still normal. I baked Emma's favorite apple pie first because she always asked for extra cinnamon on top. Then I made Lucas's favorite sugar cookies shaped like little snowmen and Christmas trees. By noon, my countertops were covered in cooling trays, ribbons, wrapping paper, and half-finished gift tags. I was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from loving people. As I wrapped presents beside the tree that evening, I found myself smiling at small memories. Emma at 6 years old, falling asleep in my lap during Christmas movies. Lucas once crying because he thought Santa wouldn't find Grandma's house. Michael as a little boy racing down the stairs every Christmas morning in dinosaur pajamas. Back then, Christmas wasn't about appearances. It was about family. I picked up the navy blue sweater I'd bought for Michael earlier that month. It wasn't expensive, but it was soft wool, and I'd spent nearly 40 minutes choosing it because the color reminded me of his father. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I wrapped it carefully anyway. No matter how distant he'd become, he was still my son. Around 7 that evening, my phone rang. "Michael." I smiled instinctively before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause on the other end. Not a warm pause, an uncomfortable one. "Hey, Mom." I immediately recognized the tone in his voice. Controlled, careful, like someone rehearsing bad news. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "What's wrong?" Another silence. Then he sighed heavily. "Mom, I need to talk to you about Christmas tomorrow." Something cold moved through my chest. I looked automatically toward the wrapped presents under the tree. "Oh, well," he cleared his throat. "Vanessa and I are having more guests than we expected." I frowned slightly. "You always have guests for Christmas." "I know, but this year it's different. Some of Vanessa's business connections are coming. Investors. People from Chicago." I didn't understand what that had to do with me. So, he exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated that I wasn't making this easier for him. "Mom, Vanessa's just worried things might feel awkward." There it was again. That word, awkward. I stared at the small crack in my kitchen wall while my fingers tightened around the phone. Awkward for who? Please don't make this harder than it already is. The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because he sounded angry, because he sounded embarrassed. Of me. I swallowed carefully. "Michael," I asked quietly, "are you asking me not to come to Christmas dinner?" He didn't answer immediately, and sometimes silence hurts more than words. Finally, he muttered, "Maybe it would be better if you rested at home this year." I actually laughed a little then, not because anything was funny, because humiliation can become so painful your body doesn't know what else to do. "I see. Mom, don't take it personally. Don't take it personally." As if a son excluding his widowed mother from Christmas was somehow a practical scheduling issue. I looked down at the tiny pair of mittens I'd knitted for Emma's dollhouse collection. My vision blurred slightly. "Did Vanessa ask you to call me?" "That's not fair." "So she did. She just thinks—" "What?" I interrupted softly. "That I'm too old, too poor, too embarrassing for her wealthy friends." Michael's voice hardened defensively. "Nobody said that. They didn't have to." He sighed again, this time impatiently. "Mom, you know how Vanessa is about appearances." And there it was. The truth. Not hidden anymore, not softened. Just laid plainly between us, like broken glass. I closed my eyes. For one terrible moment, I suddenly remembered Michael at 8 years old, standing beside me in a grocery store, because another child mocked my old winter coat. My little boy had looked up at that child and said proudly, "My mom's prettier than your mom." That little boy was gone now. In his place stood a man who cared more about impressing strangers than protecting his mother's dignity. "When were you planning to tell the children?" I asked quietly. "Well, just say you weren't feeling well." That hurt even more, because it meant he'd already planned the lie. I stood up and walked slowly toward the living room window, staring out at the falling snow. Every Christmas light on my street blurred together through tears I refused to let fall. "Mom," Michael said cautiously, "are you still there?" "Yes." "I just think this is best for everyone. Everyone. Except me." I could hear voices in the background then, laughter, music, Vanessa asking something faintly from across the room. Michael lowered his voice. "Look, we'll visit after the holidays, okay?" I almost asked him if he even heard himself. But suddenly I was too tired to beg for basic love from my own child. So instead I said the only thing my pride would allow. "I hope your guests enjoy the pie." "What?" "The apple pie, the peppermint bark, the cookies. I spent 2 days making them for your family." He went quiet again, and for the first time in the conversation he sounded ashamed. "Mom," but it was too late for apologies that hadn't even fully formed yet. "Merry Christmas, Michael." Then I hung up. The silence afterward felt enormous. I stood motionless in the middle of my living room while the grandfather clock near the stairs ticked steadily in the background. Tick, tick, tick. Almost like time itself was watching my heart break. Finally, I walked toward the Christmas tree and lowered myself carefully onto the couch. The presents underneath suddenly looked foolish, pathetic, like evidence of a love that only existed on one side anymore. I picked up Emma's gift first and held it against my chest. Then Lucas's, then Michael's sweater. My hands trembled slightly as I stared at the wrapping paper. I wondered how many small humiliations I had ignored over the years, because I was afraid of losing my family completely. How many excuses I had made for them. How many times I had mistaken tolerance for love. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. A text from Vanessa. "Thank you for understanding, Katrina. We'll celebrate another time." Not Mom, not even Mrs. Powell, just Katrina. cold, formal, distant, like I was some inconvenient neighbor instead of the woman who gave birth to her husband. I placed the phone face down on the coffee table. Then, for the first time in 11 years, I walked into Richard's old office and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside sat several folders, investment records, legal documents, and one sealed envelope Ethan Caldwell told me never to open unless I was finally ready to stop protecting people who no longer deserved it. Outside, snow continued falling gently across Columbus, and somewhere across the city my son was decorating his perfect Christmas table without realizing he had just made the most expensive mistake of his entire life. Richard Powell never cared about looking rich. That was probably why we survived long enough to become wealthy. The world imagines billionaires as loud people, flashy people, people who need everyone else to know exactly how important they are. Richard was the opposite. He wore the same old leather watch for 20 years, drove pickup trucks until the tires practically begged for mercy, ate peanut butter toast almost every morning of his adult life. But my husband possessed something rare: vision. I met Richard when I was 22 years old, working part-time at a hospital cafeteria outside Cleveland. He was young, brilliant, awkward, and completely incapable of flirting normally. Our first conversation lasted 45 minutes because he accidentally spilled coffee all over my apron and felt so guilty he kept apologizing until my shift ended. 3 years later, we were married. 10 years after that, Richard co-founded a tiny medical technology company with two friends from graduate school. At the time, nobody believed in them. The company operated out of a cramped office above a pharmacy. I remember winters when we barely had enough money to cover heating bills, while Richard stayed awake until 3 in the morning writing research proposals. There were nights I worried we'd lose everything, but Richard always believed they were building something important. "We're not chasing money," he told me once while sitting at our tiny kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. "We're trying to save lives." And eventually they did. Their company developed early diagnostic technology, capable of detecting neurological diseases years before symptoms fully appeared. Hospitals started paying attention. Investors followed. Then pharmaceutical companies came calling. Within 15 years, the tiny startup nobody respected had become one of the most valuable medical technology firms in the country. But by then, Richard was already sick. Pancreatic cancer, aggressive, cruel. I still remember the hospital room where he told me he was dying. Snow was falling outside the windows that day too, just like now. Funny how life circles back sometimes. Richard held my hand and said quietly, "Katrina, promise me something." I could barely breathe through my tears. "Anything. Don't let money turn Michael into someone unrecognizable." At the time, I thought grief was making him paranoid. Michael was only 31 back then, kind-hearted, hard-working, loving. But Richard saw things earlier than I did. He noticed how Michael became fascinated with status after getting promoted at his finance job, how he started admiring wealthy people more than good people, how he slowly began measuring worth by appearances. "You've always seen the best in people," Richard whispered weakly from that hospital bed. "That's one of the reasons I love you. But sometimes love makes us blind." 3 months later, he was gone. And my entire life split into before and after. Most widows my age talk about loneliness first. Mine wasn't loneliness. It was silence. The silence after 40 years beside someone who understood you completely. The silence of waking up and remembering all over again. The silence of eating dinner alone. After Richard died, the company board expected me to sell my shares quietly and disappear. Instead, I surprised all of them. I attended meetings, studied financial reports, learned everything I could about the business Richard helped build. People underestimated me constantly back then, especially the men. One board member actually asked if I understood what equity diversification meant. I smiled politely, while owning more shares than anyone else in the room. That became the story of my life after Richard died. People seeing an older woman and assuming weakness, assuming ignorance, assuming irrelevance. I stopped correcting them after a while. There's power in being underestimated. Over the next decade, the company exploded in value. Our technology expanded globally. New patents multiplied profits beyond anything Richard and I had ever imagined during those early struggling years. Meanwhile, I kept living in the same small Ohio house. I still clipped grocery coupons, still bought sweaters during sales, still drove my old Buick. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. Wealth never impressed me the way it impressed other people. Freedom impressed me. Privacy impressed me. Peace impressed me. And honestly, secrecy protected me too, especially from Michael and Vanessa. The first time Michael asked about inheritance was only 6 months after Richard's funeral. Not directly, carefully, politely, but I noticed. "Mom," he said one evening while helping me fix a porch light, "have you thought about long-term financial planning?" Financial planning. Such clean little words for something uglier underneath. At the time, I convinced myself he was only worried about me. Now I know better. Still, despite my concerns, I helped him constantly over the years. When Michael and Vanessa bought their oversized house, they believed the bank approved everything because of Michael's excellent financial instincts. What they never knew was that I quietly guaranteed part of the mortgage through a private trust. 3 years later, when Michael nearly lost his job after a disastrous investment recommendation at work, I anonymously purchased enough company stock through intermediaries to stabilize the situation until the scandal faded. He thought he survived through luck. It was me, always me. Even Vanessa's boutique business survived its first terrible year because an anonymous investor covered several outstanding debts behind the scenes. I watched my family enjoy comfortable lives, built partly by sacrifices they never even recognized. And I accepted that, gladly, because love isn't supposed to keep score, but exclusion changes things. Humiliation changes things. That night, after Michael told me not to come for Christmas, I sat alone in Richard's old office holding the sealed envelope Ethan had warned me about. The paper felt strangely heavy in my hands. Eventually, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard. His handwriting immediately shattered me. Even after 11 years, seeing it felt like hearing a ghost speak. "Katrina, if you're reading this, it means the people we loved may have forgotten what truly matters. Do not confuse kindness with surrender. Do not spend your final years begging for love from people who only value comfort. And most importantly, stop protecting those willing to wound you. You taught Michael compassion. If he abandoned it, that choice belongs to him now. I love you enough to tell you the truth, even when it hurts." For a long time, I simply cried. Not delicate tears, real ones. The kind older women cry when nobody is around to witness it. Finally, around midnight, my phone rang. Ethan Caldwell again. "You should know," he said carefully, "the acquisition announcement was moved forward." I wiped my eyes. "How far forward? Press release goes public tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. Christmas morning. I leaned back slowly in Richard's chair. "So that's it," I whispered. "Yes." There was a pause. Then Ethan asked softly, "Are you certain about the changes to the will?" I looked toward the living room, where Michael's unopened Christmas gift still sat beneath my tree. My son had chosen appearances over his mother, and somehow that hurt more than losing billions ever could. "Yes," I said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I'm certain." Outside my window, church bells rang softly across the snowy Ohio night, and while my son prepared his perfect Christmas celebration without me, the world was only hours away from discovering exactly by who Katrina Powell really was. The humiliation should have ended after Michael told me not to come for Christmas, but life has a cruel way of proving that heartbreak can always deepen. Christmas Eve morning arrived cold and gray. Snow covered my neighborhood in soft white silence, while the rest of the city rushed around buying last-minute gifts and groceries. I barely slept the night before. Richard's letter stayed folded beside my bed like a wound I kept reopening. Around 10 in the morning, I forced myself to continue with my usual routine. I made coffee, watered the little poinsettia near the kitchen sink, turned on old jazz music to make the house feel less empty. I told myself I would survive this Christmas with dignity. Then my iPad rang with an incoming video call. Emma. A smile immediately touched my face. I answered quickly. "There's my favorite girl." Emma's small face appeared on the screen, framed by messy brown curls and excitement. "Grandma, look what Mom bought for tonight." Before I could answer, the screen bounced wildly as Emma carried the tablet through the enormous Powell house. Christmas decorations glittered everywhere. White roses, gold ornaments, a 12-foot tree covered in professionally coordinated ribbons. It looked beautiful and strangely cold. "You've been busy," I said gently. "Mom's stressed," Emma whispered dramatically. "She's making everybody polish glasses." Despite everything, I laughed softly. Then Emma lowered her voice even more. "Are you really sick, Grandma?" My chest tightened instantly. "What do you mean Dad said you couldn't come because you weren't feeling good?" There it was, the lie Michael planned so easily. I looked away from the screen for a moment because I suddenly couldn't trust my expression. "I'm okay, sweetheart." Emma frowned. "Then why aren't you coming?" Before I could answer, another voice echoed through the house. "Emma." "Did you finish setting the dessert table, Vanessa?" Emma rolled her eyes dramatically. "Coming." Then she looked back at me. "I miss you already." The words nearly broke me. "I miss you too, baby." Just as Emma started speaking again, she accidentally tapped the screen while carrying the iPad. The camera angle shifted downward awkwardly, and suddenly they forgot I was still connected. I heard Vanessa's voice first. "Did she buy those awful homemade cookies again?" A burst of laughter followed. Another woman answered. "Wait, his mother actually still bakes everything herself." Vanessa laughed lightly. "Oh, Katrina lives in another century. Honestly, she'd probably show up wearing one of those outdated thrift store coats again." More laughter. Every muscle in my body froze. I should have ended the call immediately, but I didn't. Because part of me needed to know the full truth, needed to stop lying to myself. Another female voice spoke. "Michael said she's struggling financially, right?" Vanessa lowered her voice, though not enough. "Well, let's just say she's very modest, sometimes painfully modest." Then came the sentence I would never forget for the rest of my life. "She looks poor enough to scare investors away." The women laughed again. Not nervous laughter, not uncomfortable laughter, cruel laughter. I sat motionless at my kitchen table while heat rushed painfully into my face. After everything I had quietly done for them, after all the sacrifices, this was how they saw me: an embarrassment, a liability, an old woman they needed hidden away before wealthy guests arrived. Then, unexpectedly, another voice interrupted. "Michael's. That's enough, Vanessa." For one brief second, hope flickered inside me. Maybe he would finally defend me. Maybe somewhere underneath all this ugliness my son still existed, but Vanessa simply sighed dramatically. "Oh, please, Michael, we're just being honest." A pause followed. Then Michael said quietly, "Just make sure Emma doesn't say anything tonight." And that was worse, far worse, because he wasn't upset about the cruelty. He was upset about appearances. Again, always appearances. I ended the call silently before anyone realized I was still there. For several long moments, I couldn't move. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller somehow. The Christmas music playing softly in the background now sounded unbearable. I reached for my coffee cup, but my hand trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. At 69 years old, you think you've already experienced every possible kind of pain. Then your child humiliates you, and life proves you wrong. I stood slowly and walked toward the living room window. Outside, children were building snowmen across the street, while their parents laughed nearby. Normal families, normal Christmases. I wondered when exactly my own family became something performative instead of real. My phone buzzed around noon. A text from Vanessa. "Can you send over your pie recipe?" One of our guests asked about it. Not a single apology, not even embarrassment, just entitlement. I stared at the message for several seconds before locking my phone without answering. About an hour later, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the door, Emma stood there wrapped in a pink winter coat, snowflakes clinging to her curls. Michael's SUV waited at the curb. "Grandma," she cried, hugging me tightly. I nearly burst into tears from the warmth of that child alone. Michael stepped out of the vehicle a moment later. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. "Emma wanted to drop off your Christmas card," he explained awkwardly. I nodded. "Thank you." An uncomfortable silence settled between us. Finally, he glanced toward the house behind me. "You doing okay?" Such a small question, asked far too late. "I'm fine." Emma tugged on my sleeve excitedly. Grandma, can I show you my dress for tonight? Of course. Before we walked inside, Michael suddenly stopped me quietly. Mom? I turned. For a second, guilt flickered across his face. Real guilt. Then it disappeared. I hope you understand this isn't personal. I looked directly into my son's eyes, and for the first time in years, I answered honestly instead of gently. That's exactly what it is, Michael. He looked away immediately. Cowardice often does that. Inside, Emma modeled her Christmas dress while twirling through my living room like a tiny dancer. Her joy felt pure in a house that suddenly contained so much grief. Before leaving, she handed me a folded Christmas card decorated with glitter and crooked handwriting. I made it myself, she said proudly. After they drove away, I sat alone on the couch and opened it carefully. Inside, Emma had written, I wish you were coming tonight because Christmas feels wrong without you. That was the moment something inside me finally shifted. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. I walked quietly into Richard's old office again and opened my desk drawer. This time, instead of crying, I pulled out my phone. Then I began organizing everything. Voicemails, texts, video recordings. Every insult, every humiliation, every lie. Not because I planned to punish them, but because for the first time I realized something important. Protecting people who repeatedly hurt you is not kindness, it's self-destruction. And somewhere across town, Vanessa Powell was preparing her elegant Christmas Eve dinner, completely unaware that the poor old woman she mocked was already gathering the evidence that would destroy the image she valued more than family itself. Christmas Eve became strangely quiet after sunset. By 6 o'clock, most houses on my street glowed warmly with lights and laughter. Cars filled driveways. Families carried casseroles through falling snow, while children ran excitedly between front yards. My house stayed still, silent. The only sound came from the soft crackling of the fireplace and the ticking grandfather clock near the staircase. I heated a small bowl of soup for dinner, but barely touched it. Appetite disappears when sadness settles deeply enough inside you. Instead, I sat near the Christmas tree, wrapped in one of Richard's old sweaters, and watched old holiday movies without really paying attention to them. Every few minutes, I glanced toward the phone, not because I expected Michael to apologize, because some foolish part of me still hoped he might. At around 7:30, my phone buzzed. For one painful second, my heart lifted. Then I saw the screen. Vanessa Powell tagged in 3 new social media photos. I stared at them silently. The first photo showed Vanessa standing beside an enormous Christmas tree in a glittering gold dress, smiling with perfect elegance beside Michael. The caption read, "Blessed to host such an intimate and beautiful Christmas gathering tonight." Intimate. I almost laughed at the cruelty of that word. The second photo showed their massive dining table covered in expensive decorations and catered food. And the third photo, that one hurt most. Emma and Lucas stood beside the fireplace, smiling politely, while holding the homemade stockings I had sewn for them years ago. My gifts still existed in their home. I just didn't. I locked the phone and placed it face down beside me. Outside, snow continued falling, steadily blanketing the world in white silence. For a long time, I simply sat there remembering older Christmases. The year Michael got his first bicycle and cried because he thought we couldn't afford one. The Christmas Richard burned the turkey so badly, we ordered pizza and laughed until midnight. The year Emma was born and Michael placed that tiny baby into my arms while whispering, "Mom, now you understand how much I love her." Back then, I believed love protected families from becoming strangers. Now I understood something painful. Love alone isn't always enough. Around 8:30, another knock sounded at my front door. This time it was Ethan Caldwell. Even at 72 years old, Ethan still looked exactly like a lawyer should. Gray wool coat, polished shoes, serious expression permanently carved into his face. But tonight his eyes softened when he saw me. "You shouldn't be alone on Christmas Eve," he said quietly. I smiled faintly. And yet here I am. He stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase dusted with snow. I brought the final documents. Of course he did. Even heartbreak doesn't stop billion-dollar business transactions. I led him into the living room, where the Christmas lights reflected softly across stacks of legal papers once he opened the briefcase. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat gently. The acquisition officially closes at midnight. I nodded slowly. And tomorrow morning. Every major financial network will carry the story. I leaned back against the couch cushions. After 11 years of secrecy, my face would suddenly become public property. Reporters, interviews, speculation, people pretending they always knew who Katrina Powell really was. The thought exhausted me already. Ethan studied me carefully. You can still delay the announcement. No. You're certain I looked toward Michael's unopened Christmas gift beneath the tree. Then toward the knitted scarves waiting for grandchildren who never came. Yes, I said softly. I'm tired of hiding. What I didn't say aloud was the deeper truth I was tired of shrinking myself to make selfish people comfortable. Ethan slid several documents across the coffee table, and the trust revisions. That part hurt more, not financially, emotionally, because signing those papers meant accepting something I had spent years denying. Michael was no longer the man Richard and I raised. I picked up the pen slowly. The trust documents were detailed and cold in the way legal language always is. But underneath all those neat paragraphs sat one brutal reality: Michael Powell would no longer inherit control over my estate. Instead, the majority of my wealth would move into protected educational and charitable foundations. Emma and Lucas would still be cared for someday, but not through their parents. Never through their parents. My hand hesitated slightly before signing. Ethan noticed. You still love him, he said quietly. A tear finally escaped before I could stop it. He's my son. That doesn't excuse what he's done. No, I whispered, but it explains why this hurts so much. After the papers were signed, Ethan carefully placed them back into his briefcase. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small wrapped package. I blinked in surprise. What's this, a Christmas gift? You didn't have to. Yes, he interrupted gently. I did. Inside the box sat an old photograph I hadn't seen in years. Richard and me, much younger, standing beside the very first tiny office their company rented decades ago. We were laughing about something outside the camera frame. Poor, exhausted, happy. I pressed trembling fingers against the photograph. Oh, Ethan. Richard kept copies of that picture in his office for years, he said softly. He said it reminded him why he worked so hard. My chest ached so sharply I could barely breathe. For several minutes, neither of us spoke again. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and sighed quietly. It's already starting. What is? He turned the phone toward me. An early financial article had just leaked online. Powell Biotech finalizes historic acquisition. Below the headline sat a blurred photograph of me entering a board meeting 6 months earlier. My stomach tightened. The world was beginning to open the door I had kept locked for over a decade. Ethan studied me carefully again. Tomorrow changes everything. I stared at the article silently. No, I said after a long pause. Tomorrow just reveals everything. Around 10 o'clock, Ethan finally left. Before stepping outside into the snow, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said quietly, Richard would be proud of you. The words nearly shattered me completely. After he left, the silence inside the house returned heavier than before. I turned off the television and sat alone beside the Christmas tree with only the soft glow of lights surrounding me. Midnight slowly approached. Christmas Day, the moment everything would change. At exactly 11:57 p.m., my phone rang again. Michael. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Merry Christmas, Mom. His voice sounded distracted. Background music and party noise still filled the line. Merry Christmas, I replied calmly. A short silence followed. Then he said something that unexpectedly broke my heart one final time. Emma cried earlier, asking why you weren't there. I closed my eyes. She should ask you that. Another silence. Then Michael sighed tiredly. Mom, can we not do this tonight? Not do this. As though my pain was an inconvenience interrupting his holiday. I suddenly realized something then. Michael genuinely believed I would always remain exactly where he left me, waiting, forgiving, accepting crumbs of affection no matter how badly he treated me. He had no idea the world would wake up differently in just a few hours. No idea that the old woman he excluded from Christmas dinner was about to become the biggest financial headline in America. And no idea that tonight was the last Christmas he would ever spend believing he held power over me. Christmas morning arrived quietly. Too quietly. I woke before sunrise out of habit and lay still for several moments staring at the ceiling while pale winter light crept through my curtains. For the first time in decades, there would be no children running through my house, no family breakfast, no crowded living room filled with wrapping paper and laughter, just silence. But strangely, the grief inside me had changed shape overnight. It no longer felt sharp and chaotic. Now it felt calm, clear, like ice after a storm. I wrapped Richard's old cardigan tighter around myself and walked downstairs. Snow covered the neighborhood in thick white layers, turning everything outside soft and almost unreal. The coffee maker hissed quietly while I stood by the kitchen window, watching distant smoke rise from chimneys across the street, families beginning Christmas morning together. At exactly 7:12 a.m., my phone started vibrating nonstop. I frowned. Then the television in my living room suddenly chimed with a breaking news alert. My stomach tightened immediately. It had begun. I picked up the remote and turned on the television. A financial news anchor appeared on screen with bright excitement in her voice. Breaking this Christmas morning, Powell Biotech has finalized what analysts are calling one of the largest medical acquisition deals of the decade. My own face appeared behind her, older than I imagined, sterner, walking into a Manhattan office building beside investors and executives. For a moment, I barely recognized myself. The anchor continued speaking rapidly. The company's largest private shareholder, previously unidentified investor Katrina Powell, is now estimated to hold a personal net worth exceeding $3.8 billion. I muted the television immediately, not because I couldn't handle hearing it, because I suddenly understood exactly what was happening across town. Michael was finding out, right now, at that exact moment. My phone rang again. Michael. I stared at his name flashing across the screen while something cold and sad moved through me. 3 missed calls already. Then 4, then 5. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked slowly toward the Christmas tree and sat down quietly beside it. The lights blinked softly against the dim morning shadows. My phone buzzed again, this time Vanessa, then Michael again, then both repeatedly. The desperation arrived astonishingly fast. I finally picked up the phone around 8 a.m., not to answer, but to listen to the voicemail notifications. Michael's first message sounded confused. Mom, call me back, please. The second sounded frightened. Mom, what the hell is going on? The third message came 20 minutes later, and that one sounded completely different. No irritation, no embarrassment, no emotional distance, only panic. Mom, please answer your phone. I closed my eyes. Amazing how quickly respect appears once money enters the room. By 9 o'clock, every major financial network carried the story. The mysterious widow investor, the hidden billionaire behind Powell Biotech. Reporters replayed old footage of me attending charity events quietly over the years. Analysts discussed my legendary investment restraint and unusually private lifestyle. One commentator called me the most elusive woman in American business. If only they knew. I wasn't elusive. I was just tired of being valued for the wrong reasons. Around 10 in the morning, Ethan Caldwell called. You've officially become national news, I noticed. You also have 6 interview requests already. I laughed softly despite myself. Absolutely not. Ethan chuckled faintly. Wise decision. Then his tone shifted. There's something else you should know. What Michael contacted my office. Of course he had. What did he want? At first, information. Ethan paused. Then he demanded to know why he'd never been told. I looked toward the snowy street outside. And what did you say? The truth. I waited quietly. That your mother protected your privacy for years because she loved you. A painful ache spread slowly through my chest. Love, always love. Even now, after everything, still love. Before Ethan hung up, he added one final thing. Katrina, be careful. With Michael. With people suddenly realizing you're valuable. The sentence lingered heavily after the call ended. because he was right. Money changes how people look at you, sometimes instantly, and nowhere was that transformation happening faster than inside Michael Powell's house. I could picture it clearly. Vanessa standing frozen in front of the television. Michael replaying every interaction from the past 11 years, every ignored phone call, every awkward dinner, every humiliating comment, every Christmas exclusion, now seen through a completely different lens, not because their hearts changed, because their calculations did. Around noon, I finally received a call from someone unexpected. Emma. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. Her little voice sounded shaky. Grandma, are you famous? Despite everything, I smiled sadly. Not exactly. Dad and Mom are fighting. The smile vanished instantly. I closed my eyes briefly. What happened? They keep yelling about you. Children always hear more than adults realize. Emma sniffled quietly. Dad said they made a terrible mistake. The words settled heavily inside me. Not we hurt Grandma. Not we behaved cruelly. A terrible mistake. Business language. Loss calculation. I spoke gently. Emma, none of this is your fault. Are you mad at us? Us. That nearly broke me. I swallowed hard before answering. No, sweetheart. Never at you. Another small silence followed. Then she whispered the question I dreaded most. Are you still coming for Christmas next year? I looked around my empty living room. The untouched presents. The lonely tree. The silence. And suddenly I couldn't answer, because I honestly didn't know anymore. I love you very much, I told her instead. I love you too, Grandma. After the call ended, I sat motionless for several minutes. Then the doorbell rang. Once, twice, then repeatedly. I already knew who it was before looking outside. Michael. He stood on my porch, wearing yesterday's expensive wool coat, snow, collecting heavily on his shoulders. Vanessa waited inside their SUV parked at the curb. Even from the window, I could see tension written across his face. Fear, too. I remained still. The bell rang again. Finally, Michael began knocking instead. Harder this time. Mom. His voice carried through the door loudly. Mom, please open the door. I closed my eyes briefly. Yesterday, I wasn't welcome at his table. Today, he couldn't get inside my house fast enough. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. Mom. I know you're in there. I slowly walked toward the front hallway, but stopped before reaching the door. On the other side, Michael sounded desperate now. Please, just talk to me. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized something painful about my son. Michael never truly saw people until he believed they possessed something useful to him. Status, connections, money, value. Yesterday I was an embarrassment. Today I was suddenly important. Not because I changed overnight, because his perception did. I rested one hand against the wall beside the door while snow blew softly outside. Then I spoke quietly through the wood between us. You told me not to come for Christmas. Silence. When Michael finally answered, his voice cracked slightly. Mom, I didn't know. And there it was, the sentence that revealed everything. Not, I didn't realize how much I hurt you. Not, I'm sorry for humiliating you. Not, I failed you as a son. Just, I didn't know. Meaning if he had known I was worth billions, he would have treated me differently. The realization settled inside me like final truth. Outside the door, my son stood trembling in the cold, while the entire country celebrated the brilliant billionaire named Katrina Powell. But inside my heart, something far more important had finally died. The illusion that love alone could survive greed. Michael stayed outside my front door for nearly 10 minutes after I stopped speaking. I could hear the muffled sound of his footsteps shifting on the porch. The wind howled softly through the trees while snow continued collecting on the shoulders of his dark coat. Part of me wanted to open the door, not because he deserved forgiveness, because mothers don't stop loving their children simply because they should. That's the tragedy of motherhood. Love survives things dignity shouldn't. Finally, Michael spoke again through the door, quieter this time. Mom, please. I stood perfectly still in the hallway. The warmth inside the house contrasted painfully with the freezing silence outside. You told me not to come because I embarrassed you, I said calmly. No. Yes, I interrupted. That's exactly what happened. Another silence followed. Then his voice lowered almost to a whisper. I made a mistake. I closed my eyes. There it was again. Mistake. Not cruelty. Not betrayal. Just bad judgment. As though excluding your widowed mother from Christmas was comparable to forgetting milk at the grocery store. What changed, Michael? I asked softly. Me or my bank account? The silence afterward answered everything. Finally, he said weakly, Mom, can we please talk face to face? I looked toward the living room, where the television still displayed financial headlines scrolling beneath my photograph. Katrina Powell, America's secret billionaire. Such absurd words. Yesterday I was invisible. Today I was valuable. No, I answered quietly. Then I walked away from the door. A few moments later, I heard his footsteps retreat slowly through the snow. I didn't look outside to watch him leave, because if I saw my son standing there heartbroken, some part of me might still cave in, and I was finally beginning to understand something important. Mercy without boundaries becomes permission. Around 2 that afternoon, my peaceful little neighborhood transformed into chaos. First came the black SUVs, then the reporters. News vans lined the street outside my house while cameras pointed toward my front porch like I was some rare animal suddenly discovered in the wild. I stared through the curtains in disbelief. How did they find me so fast? My phone rang again. Ethan. They tracked property records, he explained immediately. I'm sending private security over now. Security. I almost laughed. Ethan. I'm a 69-year-old widow in Ohio, not a movie star. You're worth nearly $4 billion. That changes things. There it was again. Everything changes once people attach numbers to your existence. By 3 o'clock, my voicemail contained messages from journalists, investment firms, charities, distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, and people suddenly pretending we were close friends. One woman from Florida actually left a message saying we'd shared a meaningful spiritual connection at a conference 10 years earlier. I had never met her in my life. Wealth attracts strangers the way blood attracts sharks. But none of those calls hurt the way Michael's did. He kept calling every 30 minutes. Each voicemail sounded more emotional than the last. Mom, please let me explain. Mom, I should have defended you. Mom, I never meant for this to happen. And finally, Mom, I'm sorry. I listened to that last message 3 times, not because I fully believed him, because some tiny broken part of me desperately wanted to. Late that afternoon, another call arrived unexpectedly. Vanessa. I almost ignored it. Almost. But curiosity won. I answered without speaking. Katrina. Her voice sounded strangely soft now. Careful. Sweet. I nearly smiled at the performance. Yes. Oh, thank goodness. She exhaled dramatically. We've been so worried about you. Worried. Interesting word from a woman who mocked my thrift store coat less than 24 hours earlier. I'm fine. A small, awkward pause followed. Then Vanessa lowered her voice emotionally. Katrina, I feel terrible about everything. I sat down slowly in my armchair. Everything. Yes. Christmas. The misunderstanding. All of it. Misunderstanding. Another carefully chosen word designed to shrink cruelty into inconvenience. What exactly was misunderstood, I asked calmly. Vanessa hesitated. Well, things got stressful hosting so many important guests. Important guests. I almost laughed aloud. Not family, not grandchildren, not love. Important guests, she continued quickly. And Michael's been under so much pressure lately. Of course. Protect Michael first. Always. Meanwhile, nobody protected me. I looked toward the old photograph of Richard on my mantel. If he could hear this conversation, he'd probably shake his head sadly. Katrina Vanessa continued softly, We're family. There it was. The word people suddenly rediscover when money appears. Family. Funny how I stopped being family the moment I became inconvenient. But the instant billions entered the conversation, suddenly, family mattered again. I spoke very carefully. Yesterday you told your friends I looked poor enough to scare investors away. Complete silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. She hadn't known I heard. Katrina I. And you called me a thrift store grandmother. Katrina, please let me explain. No, I interrupted quietly. You already explained perfectly. Another long silence followed. This time, when Vanessa finally spoke again, her voice cracked slightly. I was wrong. For a brief moment, I heard something genuine there. Fear. Not remorse. Fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of losing access. Fear of realizing the old woman she dismissed held more power than everyone at her Christmas party combined. I think you should leave me alone for now, I said softly. Katrina, please. Then I ended the call. My hands trembled afterward, not from anger, from grief. Because this wasn't how I imagined growing old. I once pictured Christmases surrounded by family grandchildren filling my home with noise, while Michael teased me about burning cookies someday. Instead, I sat alone inside a house, surrounded by reporters, while my son and daughter-in-law scrambled desperately to repair the relationship they shattered themselves. At sunset, another black SUV pulled into my driveway, but this one belonged to Ethan's security team. Two polite men introduced themselves and quietly positioned near the property. The entire situation felt surreal. Yesterday, I was invisible. Today, strangers guarded my front yard. Money changes the temperature of every room you enter. That evening, I finally turned my phone completely off. No more calls, no more apologies, no more carefully rewritten history. I made tea and sat beside the fireplace while snow fell heavily outside. For the first time in days, the house felt peaceful again. Then, just after 8 o'clock, someone knocked softly at my door. Not pounding like Michael earlier, gentle, careful. I opened it cautiously. Emma stood there wrapped in her winter coat holding a small plastic container. Behind her, Michael's SUV waited at the curb again, but this time, Michael stayed inside the vehicle. Emma looked up at me nervously. I brought you leftovers, she whispered. My heart nearly collapsed. I knelt carefully despite my aching knees. Oh, sweetheart. She held out the container sadly. It's Christmas dinner. I took it with trembling hands. Inside sat a slice of turkey mashed potato stuffing and a tiny piece of apple pie. The pie I baked. Emma's eyes filled with tears. It didn't feel like Christmas without you there. I pulled her into my arms immediately. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the dark Ohio street while my granddaughter cried against my shoulder. And somewhere inside the SUV parked at the curb, my son sat alone with the terrible realization that money had not ruined Christmas. His choices had. The week after Christmas felt like living inside someone else's life. Every morning, reporters still waited outside my street. Financial magazines called me the hidden queen of biotech. Television hosts debated why a billionaire would choose to live in a modest Ohio home instead of some glass mansion overlooking Manhattan, but none of them understood the real story. The story wasn't about money, it was about what people become when they think you have none. By December 28th, my phone contained over 200 unread messages. Most came from strangers. The ones that mattered came from Michael. At first, his messages sounded panicked, then emotional, then desperate. Finally, they became softer, smaller somehow, like a man slowly realizing he couldn't fix the situation with charm or excuses anymore. One voicemail arrived just before midnight. Mom, I know you probably hate me right now. I stopped the recording immediately. Because hatred had nothing to do with it. If anything, that was the problem. I still loved him, and loving someone who wounded you deeply creates a pain difficult to describe. The day after New Year's Eve, I finally left the house for the first time since the news broke. Ethan insisted security accompany me, which felt ridiculous until photographers literally followed my car through downtown Columbus. I used to walk unnoticed through grocery stores. Now strangers stared openly. One woman approached me near the produce section with tears in her eyes. "You remind me of my mother," she whispered. "My brothers abandoned her after my father died." I stood there speechless while she hugged me unexpectedly. That became the strangest part of sudden public attention. People weren't fascinated by the money. They were responding to the loneliness, to the humiliation, to the familiar pain of being discarded once they stopped being useful. That night, when I returned home exhausted, I found fresh flowers sitting on my porch. No card. But I recognized Michael's handwriting on the florist receipt immediately. White lilies, my favorite. For a long moment, I simply stared at them, Then I carried them inside despite myself, because after 42 years of motherhood, rejecting gestures from your child still feels unnatural. 3 hours later, my phone rang again. Michael. This time, after weeks of silence, I answered. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally, he whispered, "Thank you for taking my call. It's your call, Michael." A shaky breath crossed the line. I didn't know if you'd ever speak to me again. I sat quietly in Richard's old armchair, while snow drifted softly outside. I'm still deciding. That honesty seemed to hit him hard. His voice cracked slightly when he answered. I deserve that. Another silence stretched between us. Not angry, just painfully heavy. Finally, Michael spoke again. I've been trying to understand why you never told me. There it was. The question underneath all the others. Why did you hide the money? I leaned my head back against the chair. Would it have changed how you treated me? He didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. Yes, he admitted quietly after a long pause. The honesty startled me. For better or worse, he continued. Yes, it would have changed things. I closed my eyes briefly. At least he finally stopped lying. I know, I whispered. His breathing sounded uneven now. Mom, I need you to believe me about something. What I never stopped loving you. Tears immediately filled my eyes, because that was the tragedy of it all. I believed him. Michael loved me, but not strongly enough to overcome vanity, not strongly enough to protect me from humiliation, and sometimes weak love damages people just as deeply as no love at all. Love without respect becomes cruelty, eventually, I said softly. The silence after that lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Michael finally spoke again, he sounded smaller somehow. You're right. Outside headlights swept briefly across my living room windows before disappearing again into the snowy street. I keep replaying Christmas Eve in my head, he admitted quietly. I can't stop thinking about you sitting here alone. I looked around the room instinctively. The tree still stood in the corner, though several needles had already fallen onto the carpet. You made your choice. I know. Another pause. Then finally, Vanessa wants us to invite you over for dinner tomorrow. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so painfully predictable. Now suddenly I was welcome. Now suddenly they wanted family dinners. What does Vanessa want exactly? I asked calmly. She wants to apologize. I stared at the dying fire in the fireplace. No, I said gently. She wants access. Michael inhaled sharply. That's not fair, isn't it? She feels horrible. Did she feel horrible before or after Forbes? Estimated my net worth? Silence again. The silence of truth cornering someone. I rubbed my temples tiredly. I heard what she said about me, Michael. I know. She laughed while people mocked me. I know. You watched it happen. This time his voice cracked openly. I know. For a brief second, I heard genuine shame there. Real shame. Not public embarrassment, not financial panic. Shame. And strangely, that hurt more than his earlier cruelty, because now I could hear the son I raised buried underneath everything greed and vanity had done to him. I don't expect forgiveness, he whispered. That's good. Another silence. Then Michael surprised me. I left Vanessa at her sister's house today. I sat upright immediately. What? We've been fighting nonstop since Christmas. His voice sounded exhausted. Mom, I don't even recognize our life anymore. I listened quietly. At first she kept talking about opportunities he admitted bitterly. Connections, investments, public appearances. She literally asked if you'd buy us a vacation property in Aspen. A cold ache spread through my chest. Of course she did. Michael laughed once, but there was no humor in it, and suddenly I realized something disgusting. What? She wasn't excited because you were successful. His voice dropped lower. She was excited because she thought your money belonged to us. Us. Ownership again. Entitlement disguised as family. I remained quiet for a long moment before speaking carefully. Do you know what hurt most? What you believed I was worth less when you thought I had less. The line went completely silent. Then I heard something unexpected. Crying. Very quiet at first, then sharper. Michael rarely cried, even as a child. Richard used to joke our son considered emotions a competitive weakness, but now he sounded broken. I'm sorry, he whispered repeatedly. Mom, I'm so sorry. I closed my eyes tightly while tears slipped silently down my own face. Part of me wanted to comfort him. That's what mothers do, even when their own hearts are bleeding. But another part, the stronger part, finally understood something important. Pain does not disappear simply because someone finally regrets causing it. I need time, I said softly. I know. And if we ever rebuild this relationship, my voice trembled slightly. It will not be because of money. I understand. I wasn't sure he truly did. Not yet. But maybe for the first time in years he was beginning to. Before hanging up, Michael spoke one final sentence quietly into the silence between us. Christmas used to feel warm when Dad was alive. I stared toward Richard's photograph on the mantel. Yes, I whispered, because back then we still knew what mattered. 3 days later, Ethan Caldwell asked me to come into his office. The request alone made my stomach uneasy. Ethan rarely sounded worried, and this time, over the phone, he sounded very worried. Snow still covered most of Columbus when I arrived downtown that Thursday morning. Ethan's law office occupied the top floor of a polished glass building overlooking the city skyline. The receptionist greeted me differently now. Before Christmas, she always smiled politely. Now she practically stood when I entered. Respect attached itself quickly once wealth became visible. Ethan met me personally near the elevators. Katrina, he said quietly, we need to talk privately. I immediately knew something was wrong. Inside his office, several thick legal folders sat neatly arranged across the conference table. I frowned. What happened? Ethan removed his glasses slowly. Michael requested copies of your previous estate documents. My chest tightened. My previous will. Yes. I sat down carefully. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan opened one folder and slid several papers toward me. I recognized my own signature immediately. The old version of my trust, the one written years earlier. Back when I still believed Michael would always protect family before status. He saw this, I asked softly. Ethan nodded. He now knows he used to be the primary beneficiary. A strange sadness moved through me then. Not because of the money, because I knew exactly what Michael must be thinking now. Not, I lost my mother's trust, but I lost billions. Ethan watched my expression carefully. He took the news badly. I almost smiled. Of course he did. The old trust had been simple. After my death, most of my holdings, including major investment shares and real estate assets, would pass directly to Michael. At the time, it felt natural. He was my only child. I trusted him completely. That trust died on Christmas Eve. What exactly did Michael say? I asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. Then he answered carefully. He believes you changed the will impulsively. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Impulsively. Interesting word. As though years of disrespect, humiliation, emotional neglect, and public shame were just temporary misunderstandings. He thinks someone manipulated me, doesn't he? Ethan remained silent, which was answer enough. I stared out the office windows overlooking snowy downtown Columbus. There's something deeply painful about realizing your child would rather believe you're mentally compromised than accept consequences for hurting you. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Katrina, there's more. I looked back toward him. Michael consulted another attorney yesterday. My stomach dropped. What kind of attorney? Elder estate litigation. The room suddenly felt colder. For several long seconds, I said nothing at all. Then quietly, he's trying to challenge the will. Possibly. A sharp ache spread through my chest. Not anger, not even shock anymore. Just grief so deep it almost felt physical. I remembered Michael at 12 years old, sobbing after his goldfish died. Michael at 16, asking me to stay awake until he got home safely from prom. Michael at 31, crying in my arms at Richard's funeral. How does a child become someone willing to legally attack his widowed mother for money? Ethan's voice softened. I'm sorry. I nodded faintly. He thinks I'm vulnerable now. He thinks your decisions were made under emotional distress after Christmas. I laughed once quietly. That bitter kind of laugh older women sometimes develop after life disappoints them too many times. Yes, I whispered. Apparently being heartbroken disqualifies me from controlling my own life. Ethan slid another document across the table. This is what concerns me most. I scanned the page slowly. Then my entire body stiffened. Michael's attorney had formally requested medical evaluations related to my mental competency. My own son was preparing to argue that I might not be mentally fit enough to manage my fortune. I looked up slowly. He's trying to declare me incompetent. Ethan sighed heavily. Not officially yet, but they're building groundwork. For a long moment, the only sound inside the office came from distant traffic outside the windows. Then something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling hurt and started feeling clear, coldly clear, because suddenly every illusion disappeared completely. Michael wasn't simply panicking anymore. He was strategizing, calculating, protecting what he believed should belong to him. And in doing so, he had crossed a line impossible to ignore. He really thinks this is about money, I said softly. Ethan studied me carefully. What do you think it's about? I looked down at the legal documents spread across the table. It's about entitlement. The word settled heavily between us, because that was the truth. Michael didn't see my fortune as mine. He saw it as delayed inheritance unfairly moved out of his reach, like a prize stolen from him, not a mother making boundaries, a system malfunctioning. Ethan folded his hands carefully. What would you like to do? I stared silently at Richard's old wedding ring still resting on my finger. Then I remembered Christmas Eve again. The phone call, the embarrassment, Vanessa laughing, Michael saying, "Just make sure Emma doesn't say anything tonight." And suddenly I understood something Richard tried warning me about years earlier. Weakness doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives disguised as tolerance, as endless forgiveness, as refusing to hold people accountable because you love them too much. I lifted my eyes toward Ethan. I want every voicemail preserved. He nodded immediately. Already done. Text too. Yes. And the video call recording from Christmas Eve. Ethan paused. You recorded it? No, I answered quietly. Emma accidentally left the call connected. Understanding flashed across his face immediately. Oh. Yes, I whispered. Oh. Because now everything had changed. This was no longer only about family pain. Michael and Vanessa had created evidence, real evidence, humiliation, manipulation, disrespect, and now an attempted competency challenge immediately after discovering my wealth. Any judge would see exactly what was happening. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Katrina, I need to ask you something difficult. What if Michael moves forward legally? Are you prepared to fight him? The question hurt more than anything else that morning, because mothers aren't built to imagine courtroom battles against their own children. But slowly, painfully, I answered honestly, yes. My voice trembled slightly, but not from uncertainty, from mourning. Ethan nodded once. Then, after a long silence, he spoke gently. For what it's worth, I think Michael expected you to collapse emotionally after Christmas. I looked toward the snowy skyline outside. He expected the old version of me, the version that protected everyone else first. I smiled sadly. That woman buried her dignity for years, trying to keep peace inside her family. Another long silence passed. Then Ethan surprised me. Richard once told me you were the strongest person he'd ever known. Tears immediately filled my eyes. Oh, Ethan. He said people mistook your kindness for softness. Ethan's voice lowered carefully. But he knew better. I wiped at my face quickly. Outside the office windows, snow drifted slowly across downtown Columbus, while cars moved below like distant shadows. The world looked peaceful from up there, but inside me, something irreversible had happened, because now I understood the full truth. Michael wasn't merely ashamed of his poor old mother. He was willing to strip away her independence the moment money entered the conversation. And somehow that betrayal hurt even more than being excluded from Christmas. Before leaving Ethan's office, I paused beside the door, then quietly asked the question already haunting me. If Michael had never discovered the money, my voice weakened slightly. Would he still be trying to declare me incompetent? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The silence itself told me everything. 3 days after my meeting with Ethan, Michael showed up at my house again. This time he came alone. No black SUV, no Vanessa, no polished image carefully constructed for wealthy neighbors, just my son standing in the snow looking exhausted. I watched him through the living room curtains for several minutes before opening the door. The January wind cut sharply through the porch as we faced each other in silence. Michael looked older than he had just 2 weeks earlier. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His beard had grown unevenly, and his expensive coat hung wrinkled across his shoulders like he'd slept in it. Grief ages people quickly. Guilt does too. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, not because I feared him, because once someone breaks your trust deeply enough, even simple things become difficult. Finally, I stepped aside silently. Michael entered slowly, looking around the house like he was seeing it for the first time. Maybe he was. The old family photographs, the worn furniture, Richard's books still lining the shelves, evidence of an entire life Michael had stopped noticing years ago. I led him into the kitchen and poured coffee automatically out of old habit. He used to love sitting at this table as a teenager after school eating cookies while telling me about football practice. Now he sat stiffly with both hands wrapped tightly around the mug. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, Michael broke the silence. I fired the attorney. I looked up sharply. "What?" "The estate lawyer." He swallowed hard. "I told him not to file anything." I studied his face carefully. "You still considered it." Pain flashed briefly across his expression. "Yes." At least he told the truth. That mattered now. Tiny fragments of truth mattered because lies had poisoned everything else. Michael stared down at the coffee in his hands. "I don't even recognize myself anymore." The word sounded genuine, but genuine regret doesn't erase damage already done. I sat across from him quietly. "You recognized yourself enough to question my mental competency." His face tightened immediately. "Mom?" "No." My voice stayed calm but firm. "Don't soften what happened." Michael closed his eyes briefly. "You're right." Outside snow drifted softly against the kitchen windows, while silence settled heavily between us. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke again. "Vanessa wanted me to go through with it. I felt something cold move through my chest. Wanted... We've been fighting constantly since Christmas." His voice sounded hollow now. "She kept saying you were unstable, emotional, vulnerable." I stared at him carefully. "And what did you say?" Michael looked away. At first, his voice weakened. I agreed. The honesty hurt more than denial would have, because this was real now. No confusion, no misunderstanding. My own son had truly believed I might be manipulated into changing my will unfairly, not because evidence existed, because he couldn't emotionally accept losing access to my money. Michael rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. Everything became about the inheritance almost immediately. I remained silent. She kept calculating numbers, he whispered bitterly, talking about investment properties, trust structures, private schools, political connections. His laugh sounded broken. "She literally started discussing what kind of yacht we should buy before we even repaired things with you." A sharp sadness settled inside me. Not surprise, just sadness. Because people rarely become greedy overnight. Greed grows quietly inside them for years before opportunity exposes it fully. Michael stared toward the old refrigerator covered in Emma's childhood drawings. "Do you know the worst part?" he asked softly. What I think part of me liked hearing it. The confession hung heavily between us. I liked imagining that kind of power, he admitted quietly. That kind of life. At least now we were finally speaking honestly. "That's what your father feared," I whispered. Michael's face tightened instantly at the mention of Richard. "I know. I studied him carefully. You know." He nodded slowly. "Dad talked to me once before he died." This surprised me. Michael swallowed hard before continuing. "He asked me if I wanted success, or status." The kitchen suddenly felt painfully small. "What did you say I told him they were the same thing?" I closed my eyes briefly. "Of course. Richard saw it coming long before I did." Michael laughed bitterly under his breath. "Dad said status was what weak people chased when they needed strangers to admire them." Tears suddenly burned behind my eyes. That sounded exactly like Richard. "He warned me not to build a life around appearances," Michael whispered, and I ignored him. Outside, a car drove slowly down the snowy street while silence settled between us again. Then Michael reached into his coat pocket carefully. I brought something. He slid a thick folder across the kitchen table toward me. I frowned. What is this? My financial records. I stared at him in confusion. Why? Because I need you to understand something. His voice shook slightly. I'm not drowning in debt. That surprised me. What Vanessa kept implying we needed money. He swallowed hard. We don't. I slowly opened the folder. Investment accounts, savings, property evaluations, retirement funds. Michael had done very well financially over the years. Not billionaire wealthy, but secure, comfortable. Then why? Why humiliate me? Why panic so viciously after discovering my fortune? Michael answered the question before I even asked it. It wasn't about survival. His voice sounded ashamed now. It was about wanting more. The honesty hit harder than any lie, because greed sounds uglier when spoken plainly. I spent years trying to impress people richer than us, he admitted quietly. Bigger houses, better vacations, better schools, better connections. He looked around my modest kitchen slowly. And meanwhile, you already had everything. I almost smiled sadly. No, Michael, not everything. Not anymore. You still don't fully understand, I said softly. His eyes lifted toward mine. This was never about whether you deserved money. Then what was it about character? The word landed heavily between us. I folded my hands carefully atop the table. Your father and I worked ourselves to exhaustion building something meaningful. Not glamorous, meaningful. Michael looked down again, and I turned it into numbers. You turn people into numbers. That one hit him visibly, because it was true. He measured worth through utility now. Connections, status, influence, financial value, even family. Especially family. Tears suddenly filled his eyes again. I don't know how to fix this. For the first time since Christmas, I answered completely honestly. You may never fully fix it. The words visibly hurt him, but false comfort would only continue the cycle. Michael nodded slowly through tears. I know. Then after a long silence, he whispered something that finally cracked my heart completely. When you didn't come for Christmas? His voice broke. Emma kept setting a place for you anyway. I covered my mouth immediately as tears spilled down my face. Every holiday memory from the past few weeks came crashing back all at once. The empty chair, the untouched gifts, the loneliness. Michael wiped at his eyes shakily. She asked me 3 times if Grandma Katrina did something wrong. Pain moved through me, so sharply I physically flinched. No child should ever feel responsible for adult cruelty, I whispered. I know. The kitchen fell silent again, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Then Michael finally asked the question sitting between us all morning. Do you think you'll ever trust me again? I looked at my son carefully. Really looked at him. Not the successful finance professional. Not the embarrassed host. Not the desperate heir. Just the tired little boy Richard and I once loved more than life itself. And quietly, painfully, I answered with the only truth I had left. I think trust grows back slower than love. Michael bowed his head and cried silently into his hands, while snow continued falling outside the little Ohio kitchen, where a family was finally beginning to face the truth about itself. 2 weeks later, I invited Michael and Vanessa to Ethan Caldwell's office. Not my house, neutral ground. That detail mattered, because my home still carried too much grief inside it, and I refused to let another painful confrontation poison the few peaceful memories I had left there. The meeting was scheduled for 11 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning. Snow melted slowly along downtown sidewalks as I stepped out of Ethan's black sedan and stared up at the tall glass building ahead of me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was preparing for battle against my own family, and somehow that realization hurt more than anything else. Ethan met me privately before the others arrived. You don't have to do this today, he said gently. Yes, I answered quietly. I do. Because avoidance had created this situation in the first place. Years of swallowing disrespect, years of minimizing pain, years of pretending small humiliations didn't matter. But they did matter. Every single one. Inside the conference room, sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows overlooking Columbus. A polished wooden table stretched across the room, with several neatly organized folders placed in front of each chair. Evidence. That's what today was about. Truth documented carefully enough that nobody could hide from it anymore. At exactly 11, Michael and Vanessa arrived. The tension between them was visible immediately. They didn't walk together, didn't look at each other. Vanessa wore an expensive cream-colored coat and pearls, but the polished image she usually carried looked fractured now. Her eyes darted nervously around the room before finally settling on me. "Katrina," she said softly. "Not Mom. Still Katrina. Interesting." Michael looked exhausted again. He offered me a small nod before sitting down quietly. Nobody touched the coffee waiting on the table. Ethan closed the conference room doors gently. Then silence settled heavily across the room. Finally, Vanessa spoke first. "I know you're angry." I looked at her calmly. "No," I said quietly. "Anger fades faster than disappointment." The sentence visibly unsettled her. Because disappointment sounds final, in a way, anger doesn't. Anger still hopes. Disappointment mourns. Vanessa folded her hands tightly together. "I've apologized repeatedly. You've explained repeatedly," I corrected gently. "Those are not the same thing." Michael lowered his eyes immediately. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly. I made insensitive comments. I stared at her for several long seconds. Insensitive. Such a careful little word. As though mocking an elderly widow for appearing poor was merely bad manners instead of cruelty. "You laughed while people humiliated me," I said calmly, "in front of my granddaughter." Vanessa's face flushed instantly. "I didn't think—" "No," I interrupted softly. "You didn't." Silence again. Then Ethan calmly slid the first folder across the table. Inside sat printed screenshots of text messages, voicemails, call logs, records. Vanessa stared downward as Ethan spoke professionally. These materials establish a timeline beginning approximately 8 months before Christmas. Michael frowned slightly. What timeline? Ethan met his eyes evenly. A pattern. The room suddenly felt colder. Ethan opened another folder. Repeated references describing Katrina Powell as embarrassing, socially inconvenient, financially insignificant, or burdensome. Vanessa immediately stiffened. "This is ridiculous." Ethan ignored the interruption. "Additionally, we have documented instances where Mrs. Powell was excluded from family functions due to perceived social image concerns." Michael rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Ethan." "No," I said quietly. "Let him continue." Because for once, everyone in this room needed to hear the truth without interruption. Ethan pressed a button on the conference table speaker system. Then Vanessa's voice filled the room. "She looks poor enough to scare investors away." Laughter followed. Clear, cruel, impossible to misunderstand. Vanessa went completely pale. Michael closed his eyes immediately, like he physically couldn't bear hearing it again. But Ethan wasn't finished. Another recording played. Michael's voice this time. "Just make sure Emma doesn't say anything tonight." The room fell silent afterward. Heavy silence. Devastated silence. Vanessa stared down at the table while Michael looked physically ill. I sat perfectly still, not triumphant, not satisfied, just tired, because this wasn't victory. This was autopsy. We were dissecting the corpse of a family relationship piece by piece. Finally, Michael whispered, "Mom," but I raised one hand gently. "No." My voice trembled slightly now, despite my effort to stay composed. For years, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Tears burned behind my eyes. I told myself Vanessa didn't really mean those comments. I told myself you were stressed, busy, distracted. Michael looked shattered now. But deep down, I continued softly. I knew. Nobody spoke. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly across downtown buildings, while my entire family sat drowning inside. Truths nobody could deny anymore. Then Ethan opened the final folder. "This concerns the competency inquiry." Vanessa immediately looked toward Michael. Michael stared straight ahead silently. Ethan continued calmly. 2 days after learning Katrina Powell's financial status, preliminary discussions began regarding her mental capacity to manage personal assets. Vanessa suddenly spoke sharply. "That was never serious. I looked directly at her, but it was real. Her silence answered me. Michael's voice cracked quietly beside her. I stopped it. Yes, I agreed softly. After it began. Another painful silence settled. Then something unexpected happened. Vanessa started crying. Not elegant tears, messy ones. Her shoulders shook while she covered her face with both hands. I'm ashamed of myself, she whispered. I studied her quietly. For a long moment, I wasn't sure whether to believe her. Then she said something surprising. I hated how invisible I felt growing up. Everyone looked at her. Vanessa wiped at her tears shakily. My parents lost everything when I was 13. We moved into a tiny apartment. Kids made fun of my clothes. Her voice trembled. I swore I'd never feel small again. Suddenly, pieces started fitting together. Not excuses, understanding. There's a difference. Vanessa looked toward me through tears. So I became obsessed with appearances. Success. Status. She laughed bitterly. And somewhere along the way, I became cruel. Michael stared at her in stunned silence. I wasn't protecting our image, she whispered brokenly. I was protecting my own fear. The room went completely still, because finally, someone stopped hiding behind polite language. No misunderstandings, no accidental insensitivity, just truth, ugly, painful truth. I looked at Vanessa quietly for several moments before answering. Fear explains behavior, I said softly, but it does not erase damage. She nodded silently through tears. Michael suddenly spoke, then his voice rough with emotion. You said something to me after Dad died. He looked toward me carefully. I didn't understand it back then. I frowned slightly. What you told me grief either softens people or hardens the worst parts of them. Tears filled my eyes instantly. I barely remembered saying it, but he did. Michael looked down at his hands. I think I let ambition harden me. The confession broke something open inside the room. Not healing, not yet, but honesty, and honesty is where healing begins. I took a slow breath before speaking carefully. You both keep talking about the money. Neither of them responded. But this, I whispered, gesturing toward the evidence folders, is why the inheritance changed. Michael's eyes closed painfully. You didn't lose billions because I became rich, I continued softly. You lost them because you forgot how to love people without measuring their value first. Complete silence. Then finally, through tears, Michael whispered the sentence I had needed to hear from the very beginning. You deserve better from me. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I believed he finally understood what this was really about. Not money, not inheritance, dignity. After the meeting at Ethan's office, I drove home alone through falling snow. The city blurred softly outside my windshield, while memories kept rising one after another, like ghosts refusing to stay buried. Michael at 5 years old, asleep on Richard's chest during Christmas movies. Michael at 17, begging us to trust him with the car for prom night. Michael at 29, proudly holding newborn Emma in the hospital while crying harder than I'd ever seen before. I kept asking myself the same impossible question. Where exactly does love end and disappointment begin? By the time I reached home, dusk had already settled across the neighborhood. The porch light glowed warmly against fresh snow, and for one painful second, the house looked exactly the way it used to when Richard was alive. Safe. Whole. I sat in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. Once there, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened Richard's final letter again. The paper had softened with age, now the folds worn thin, from rereading it too many times over the past month. I carried it into the living room and sat beside the fireplace while snow tapped softly against the windows. Then I read his words slowly aloud. If you're reading this, it means the people we loved may have forgotten what truly matters. My voice broke halfway through the sentence. Tears blurred the ink, while memories of Richard flooded back so vividly, it almost hurt to breathe. He always understood people more clearly than I did. I used to think that was because he was smarter. Now I realize it was because I spent my whole life searching for goodness in people, while Richard searched for truth. And truth is often much harder to look at directly. The next morning, Michael called again. This time I answered immediately. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded fragile. Hi. A long silence stretched between us before he finally spoke. Can I ask you something? Yes. Did Dad know this would happen? The question settled heavily inside my chest. I looked toward Richard's photograph sitting beside the fireplace. He worried about it, I answered quietly. Michael exhaled shakily. I found something yesterday. My stomach tightened. What? One of Dad's journals. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard kept journals for decades. Not daily diaries exactly, more like scattered thoughts, observations, lessons he didn't want forgotten. What did it say? Michael was quiet for several seconds. Then softly, he wrote about me. Pain flickered through me immediately. Richard loved Michael deeply. But love sometimes forces parents to see painful truths about their children, long before those children see them themselves. What exactly did he write? I asked gently. Michael's voice cracked slightly. He said he was afraid I'd spend my life chasing admiration instead of character. Tears immediately filled my eyes. That sounded exactly like Richard. Michael laughed once bitterly. There was another line, too. I waited. He wrote. Michael swallowed hard. A person who needs wealthy strangers to validate them will eventually stop recognizing genuine love when it's standing right in front of them. The room suddenly felt painfully still. Outside, snow slid quietly from tree branches, while grief moved through me all over again. Because Richard had seen this coming years before Christmas ever shattered us. Michael's breathing sounded uneven now. I hated reading it, he admitted quietly, because it was true. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said softly, Your father never stopped loving you. I know. He worried because he loved you. Another silence. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke me. I think I spent so many years trying to look successful that I forgot how to be good. I covered my mouth as tears slipped down my face, because underneath all the greed, vanity, and terrible choices, there was still my son, wounded, flawed, lost, but still there. That afternoon, Emma and Lucas came to visit for the first time since Christmas. Vanessa dropped them off, but stayed in the car. That detail told me more than words could. The children burst through the front door carrying snow on their boots and noise into a house that desperately needed life inside it again. Grandma Lucas shouted before nearly tackling me with a hug. Emma held me tightly for several seconds longer than usual. Children sense broken things instinctively. I made hot chocolate while they sat at the kitchen table telling me stories about school winter break and the argument Lucas got into with another little boy over football teams. Normal conversation, normal love. God, I missed this. At one point, Emma looked up carefully from her mug. Grandma, yes, sweetheart. Are Dad and Mom getting divorced? The question startled me so sharply I nearly dropped my spoon. Why would you ask that? Emma shrugged, sadly. They fight a lot now. Pain moved through me immediately. Children always pay the price for adult selfishness. I knelt beside her chair gently. Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure themselves out, I said softly. Emma studied me carefully with those observant eyes so much like Michael's when he was young. Dad cries now. That one hit hard, because Michael rarely cried even as a child. Emma lowered her voice. I heard him tell Mom he ruined Christmas forever. I looked away briefly because my eyes suddenly burned again. No, I whispered softly. Not forever. I hoped that was true. I really did. After the children left later that evening, I found myself standing alone in Richard's old office again. The room still smelled faintly like cedar wood and old books. For years, I kept everything exactly the way he left it because changing anything felt too much like losing him twice. I opened one of the lower desk drawers and removed an old photo album. Inside sat pictures from decades of Christmases. Michael decorating cookies beside me at age 7. Richard pretending to wear wrapping bows as earrings. Emma asleep beside the tree one Christmas morning, with a candy cane still clutched in her tiny hand. I realized something painful then. Money hadn't destroyed my family. Fear had. Vanessa feared becoming poor again. Michael feared appearing unimportant. And I feared losing my son badly enough that I tolerated disrespect for years instead of confronting it sooner. Fear poisons people quietly. That night around 10 o'clock, another message arrived from Michael. This one was different. Short. Simple. No excuses. No emotional speeches. Just honesty. I spent years trying to become the kind of man wealthy people respected. Dad spent his whole life trying to become the kind of man his family could trust. I finally understand the difference. I stared at the message for a very long time. Then I walked slowly toward the living room window. Snow covered the street in soft white silence while distant Christmas lights still glowed faintly across neighboring houses. For the first time since Christmas Eve, the anger inside me had started changing, not disappearing. Healing doesn't happen that quickly, but changing. Because now Michael finally saw what Richard always tried teaching him. Status impresses strangers. Character protects families. And one matters infinitely more when life becomes painful. By February, the media frenzy surrounding me had finally started fading. Reporters stopped camping outside my street. Financial analysts moved on to newer headlines. The world lost interest once the mystery became ordinary. I was grateful for that. Fame felt exhausting. But inside my family, the consequences of Christmas were still unfolding quietly every day. Michael and Vanessa had separated temporarily, not officially divorced, not yet. But Vanessa moved into a luxury condo downtown while Michael stayed alone in the big suburban house with the children most nights. The same house they once believed would impress everyone. Now Michael admitted it mostly felt empty. One snowy afternoon, Ethan drove me to a property on the edge of Columbus, an old community center. The building needed work. The roof leaked slightly, the paint had faded, and the parking lot carried years of neglect. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew. "This is the one," I whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're certain?" I looked around the quiet hallways. Old folding chairs stacked near the walls, a tiny library room with dusty shelves, a kitchen large enough to serve dozens of people. I'm certain. For weeks I had been thinking about loneliness, not my own, everyone else's. The widows eating dinner alone every night, the elderly fathers forgotten after retirement, the grandparents spending holidays staring at silent televisions while their families posted smiling pictures online without them. People like me. Invisible people. So I bought the building, not as an investment, as a promise. Over the next month, renovations began immediately. New flooring, fresh paint, warm lighting, comfortable furniture, a real kitchen, a small counseling office. And slowly, the Richard Powell Community House came to life. When the local newspaper asked why I was funding it personally, I answered honestly, because nobody should feel disposable once they grow old. That quote spread online faster than any financial headline ever had. Thousands of comments appeared underneath, most from older women, women abandoned by children after losing husbands, women mocked for becoming inconvenient, women treated like burdens instead of human beings. I read every single message and cried through many of them. One evening in March, Michael came by unexpectedly after work. This had slowly become our new rhythm. No dramatic speeches anymore, no desperate pleading, just small, honest conversations, real ones. He helped me carry grocery bags inside before sitting quietly at the kitchen table. "You bought a community center," he said softly. "I did. For lonely seniors." "Yes." Michael nodded slowly. "Dad would have loved that." The mention of Richard still hurt, but now it hurt warmly instead of sharply. Grief changes shape over time. Michael looked around the kitchen quietly. "You seem happier lately." I considered that honestly. Not happier exactly, stronger. "I stopped begging people to value me," I answered softly. "That changes a person." Michael lowered his eyes immediately. "I know." There was still sadness between us. Maybe there always would be. Some wounds heal into scars instead of disappearing. But scars can still exist beside love. After a long silence, Michael finally spoke again. "Vanessa wants to meet with you." I looked up carefully. "Why?" "She says there are things she needs to say face to face." I stirred my tea slowly. Part of me wanted to refuse immediately, but another part remembered something important Richard used to say. "People can't grow if nobody allows room for it," when I asked quietly. Michael looked surprised I hadn't rejected the idea completely. "She said, whenever you're ready." A week later, Vanessa arrived at my house alone. No designer handbag, no perfect makeup, no carefully polished image. She looked tired, human. For several moments, we simply sat across from each other in my living room, while nervous silence filled the space between us. Finally, Vanessa spoke. I sold the condo. I blinked slightly. What? She gave a weak laugh. It turns out running away into luxury apartments doesn't magically fix your character. That almost sounded like the old Vanessa, again sharp humor, covering pain. But this time there was honesty underneath it. She folded her hands tightly together. I've spent my whole life terrified of becoming powerless again. I listened quietly. My father lost everything when I was young. After that, people treated us differently overnight. Her eyes lowered. I hated how humiliating it felt. I nodded slowly, because I understood humiliation now too. But instead of becoming compassionate, her voice cracked slightly. I became obsessed with protecting myself from ever feeling small again. Tears gathered in her eyes, and somewhere along the way, I started measuring human worth by appearances. Silence settled softly around us. Then Vanessa whispered the sentence I never expected to hear from her. When I mocked your clothes that night, I wasn't really seeing you. That one hurt deeply because it was true. People who worship status stop seeing humanity clearly. They only see symbols. Success, failure, value, embarrassment. Vanessa wiped at her face quickly. You were kind to me for years, even when I didn't deserve it. I thought about the anonymous business bailout, the gifts, the support, the patience. Yes, I had been kind. Too kind sometimes. I confused your gentleness with weakness, she admitted. The honesty mattered, more than perfect apologies ever could. Because honesty is expensive for prideful people. I looked directly at her. Do you love Michael? She immediately nodded through tears. Yes, then stop teaching him that worth comes from status. Her crying deepened then, because she knew. She finally understood the damage. Not just to me, to her children, to herself, to her marriage, to the man Michael was becoming. Before leaving, Vanessa paused near the front door nervously. I don't expect forgiveness. I studied her carefully. No, I answered softly. But I do expect growth. She nodded silently. And somehow, for the first time since Christmas, I believed growth might actually be possible. That night, I updated my estate documents one final time, not to restore the original inheritance. That would have erased necessary consequences. But I made one important change. Emma and Lucas's educational trust would remain permanently protected and fully funded regardless of what happened between the adults. The children would not inherit the emotional damage of their parents' mistakes. As Ethan finalized the paperwork, he looked at me carefully. You know, he said quietly, most people with your resources would have chosen revenge. I thought about that for a long moment. Then I looked toward the old family photograph sitting beside my fireplace. No, I whispered softly. Revenge keeps you emotionally tied to the people who hurt you. Ethan smiled faintly. So what do you call this? I looked around my peaceful little house, at Richard's photograph, at the snow falling softly outside, at the life I was finally rebuilding with dignity instead of fear. Boundaries, I answered. And for the first time in a very long while, that word no longer felt cruel. It felt healthy. The next Christmas arrived quietly, not with scandal, not with television cameras, not with breaking financial headlines, just snow. Soft, steady snow falling across Columbus while warm lights glowed inside the Richard Powell community house. I stood near the front entrance, adjusting silver ribbon around a wreath while volunteers carried trays of food through the hallway behind me. Laughter echoed from the dining room. Real laughter. The kind that sounds different when people feel safe. A year earlier, I spent Christmas Eve crying alone beside a tiny tree after my own son told me not to come. Now, more than 80 elderly people filled the community center eating dinner together instead of sitting isolated in empty homes. Widows, retired veterans, grandparents abandoned by busy families, people society slowly forgets once their usefulness fades. Not tonight. Tonight they mattered. Emma and Lucas raced through the hall, wearing matching red sweaters, while arguing over who got to hand out dessert trays first. Grandma Lucas shouted excitedly, "Mr. Henderson wants extra pie again." I laughed softly. Then Mr. Henderson gets extra pie. Emma appeared beside me, carrying a stack of handmade Christmas cards the children created for the guests. Sheila cried when I gave her one, she whispered sadly. I knelt beside her gently. Sometimes people cry when they finally feel remembered. Emma thought carefully about that, then quietly hugged me. At 12 years old now, she seemed older somehow, kinder too. Pain matures children faster than it should. Across the room, volunteers helped residents decorate cookies while old jazz music played softly through the speakers. The building no longer looked forgotten. Warm yellow lights glowed against freshly painted walls. Comfortable chairs filled the reading corners. Garland wrapped around stair railings while the scent of cinnamon and turkey drifted through the halls. Life had returned here. And strangely enough, so had mine. Around 6 o'clock, Ethan Caldwell arrived, carrying several wrapped gifts donated anonymously for the residents. Even retired lawyers become softer at Christmas. "You built something beautiful here," he said quietly while watching the crowded dining room. "No," I answered softly. "We did." Because healing rarely happens alone. As the evening continued, I moved through the rooms greeting guests, listening to stories, refilling coffee cups, hugging women who reminded me painfully of who I almost became after Richard died. Invisible. Forgotten. One elderly man squeezed my hand tightly before dinner. "My son hasn't called me in 3 years," he admitted quietly. Tonight was the first Christmas I didn't feel completely alone. I nearly cried right there beside him. Because loneliness in old age carries a particular kind of ache. Not loud, not dramatic, just endless quiet. And I understood that quiet intimately. Later that evening, while children sang Christmas songs near the fireplace, I stepped outside briefly onto the snow-covered front steps for air. The cold winter wind brushed softly against my face while snowflakes drifted beneath streetlights. For a moment, I simply stood there listening to distant laughter inside the building behind me. Peace. Real peace. Not perfection, not erased pain. Peace. Then headlights slowly pulled into the parking lot. A familiar black SUV. My heart tightened immediately. Michael stepped out alone. No Vanessa, no dramatic entrance. Just my son, standing quietly in falling snow with nervousness written across his face. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he slowly walked toward me. Older women notice these things. The way guilt changes posture. The way regret softens arrogance. The way sorrow humbles people. Michael looked humbler now than I had ever seen him in his entire life. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said quietly. I studied him carefully. Merry Christmas. Snow gathered across his dark coat while silence stretched gently between us. Finally, he looked toward the brightly lit community center. "It's beautiful inside." I smiled faintly. "It matters to people." He nodded slowly. "I know." For several moments, we simply stood there together, watching snow drift through the parking lot. Then Michael surprised me. "I sold the house." I looked up sharply. "What?" "The big one." He gave a small, sad laugh. "Turns out I spent years buying things I thought successful people were supposed to own." I stayed quiet. We moved into something smaller, closer to Emma and Lucas's school. His voice softened. "It feels more like home." Something warm flickered quietly inside my chest then. Not pride exactly. Hope. Small, fragile hope. Michael shoved his hands into his coat pockets nervously. "I brought something for you." He handed me a small wrapped box. Inside sat Richard's old leather watch. I stared at it speechlessly. "I found it in storage," Michael whispered. "I think Dad would want you to have it back." Tears immediately filled my eyes. Richard wore that watch nearly every day for 20 years. I gently touched the worn leather band while memories crashed through me all at once. Christmas mornings, hospital rooms, coffee at sunrise, 40 years of marriage. Michael's voice shook slightly. "I spent so much time chasing people who didn't really care about me." He looked down at the snow. "And meanwhile, I neglected the people who loved me unconditionally." I closed my fingers carefully around the watch. "You hurt us deeply," I said softly. "I know. And trust doesn't magically return because you regret losing it." His eyes filled immediately. "I know." The honesty mattered. No excuses anymore. No manipulation. Just truth. Finally, Michael looked directly at me. "I'm not here for money." I believed him. For the first time in a very long while, I truly believed him. "I'm here because last Christmas I abandoned my mother emotionally," he whispered brokenly. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life if I don't spend whatever time we have left trying to become better. Tears slipped quietly down my face. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Some damage never fully disappears. But growth had finally begun. Real growth. The painful kind. Inside the community center, Emma suddenly spotted us through the glass doors. Dad. A second later, she came bursting outside, followed by Lucas. The children wrapped themselves around both of us, while snow continued falling softly around the parking lot, and for one fragile, beautiful moment, we stood there together again. Not perfect, not healed completely, but honest. Sometimes honesty is the first real Christmas miracle a family gets. Later that night, after the guests left and volunteers finished cleaning, I sat alone inside the quiet community center beside the enormous Christmas tree. The building smelled faintly of coffee pine and cinnamon. Warm smells, safe smells. I held Richard's old watch carefully in my lap while staring at the lights blinking softly across the room. A year ago, I thought losing my son's respect would destroy me. Instead, it forced me to rediscover my own. And maybe that was the lesson hidden underneath all this pain. Your value does not disappear simply because someone fails to recognize it, not when you grow older, not when you become inconvenient, not even when family disappoints you. Outside snow covered the streets of Columbus in quiet white peace while I finally allowed myself to believe something I hadn't believed in a very long time. Not every broken family heals completely, but some broken people still can. Some of the deepest heartbreak in life does not come from strangers. It comes from the people we once believed would always protect our hearts. This story reminds us that growing older should never mean becoming invisible, disposable, or less worthy of love. Too many parents spend their final years shrinking themselves just to avoid becoming a burden to their own families. They stay quiet after disrespect. They forgive humiliation to keep peace. They accept loneliness because they are afraid of losing the people they love. But love without dignity becomes pain. Katrina's story is not really about money. The billions only revealed what was already hiding inside people's hearts. True character appears when there is nothing to gain. And sometimes the saddest truth is realizing that people valued us differently when they believed we had less to offer. Yet this story is also about hope. Because healing begins the moment we stop begging others to recognize our worth and start protecting it ourselves. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Walking away from disrespect is not selfish. And forgiving someone does not mean allowing them to hurt you again. What touched me most is that Katrina never became bitter. She turned her pain into compassion for others who felt forgotten. She proved that even after heartbreak, a person can still choose kindness without surrendering their self-respect. And maybe that is the real lesson here. Your value does not decrease because someone failed to appreciate you. Not when you age. Not when life changes. Not when family disappoints you. If this story moved you, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt overlooked or hurt by someone you loved? Do you think Michael truly changed in the end? And where are you watching from today? If stories like this speak to your heart, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional family dramas, healing stories, and powerful life lessons. Sometimes a single story can remind us that we are not alone.